Fantastic. Well, I'm joined by fellow co-authors and experts, and we have a terrific discussion planned for you today. So let's go ahead and get started. So hi, everyone, and welcome. For folks who don't know me, my name's Jen Goldsack. I'm the CEO here at the Digital Medicine Society, or DIME. If you're not familiar with DIME, we are a global nonprofit dedicated to advancing the safe, effective, ethical, and equitable use of digital technologies to optimize health. Delighted to welcome you to Journal Club today. Journal Club is one of my favorite standing events in the DIME calendar. We have the opportunity to listen, learn, and discuss live with authors of some of the leading scholarship in our field that's really shaping the future of digital medicine. And we are joined by tremendous experts today who I'll go ahead and ask to introduce themselves in just a minute. Before we do that, so that all of you feel well situated and you know how to fully take part in this discussion, because the second part of this will indeed be a discussion, we can run through some housekeeping bits quite quickly. So first of all, full disclosure, as I'm sure someone announced to you as you join, we are recording today's session. Great thing about that is the recording will be available to colleagues, and we'll post the recording and the slides a bit later today on the DIME website. We also invite you to join in the conversation. The intent here is for you to have the opportunity to talk to experts in the field about their work. So there's a couple of ways you can do that. As we get to the moderated chat session, I'll be watching the list of attendees. So if you'd like to raise your hand, not like this, but using the digital function, we can call on you live, we'll unmute you and you can ask your question live. If you're not somewhere you can talk, you're welcome to drop your questions into the chat or the Q&A. And we don't only sort of appreciate those, we'll be watching for them and look forward to those questions and that part of the discussion. But most importantly, let's get to know our experts who are joining us on the line today. It really is an extraordinary group that we've enjoyed partnering with, that we've enjoyed working with, writing with over the last year or so now. So perhaps I will invite each of you to give a self-introduction. You will do yourself better justice than me. And Ariel, I'm going to come to you first, if you wouldn't mind.
Thank you so much, Jen. It's an absolute delight to be visiting the Journal Club again. My name is Ariel Doris Stern. I am an associate professor at Harvard Business School, where I teach an MBA class called Transforming Healthcare Delivery. That's actually kicked off yesterday and is happening again later today. So I'm in the thick of it. My background is in healthcare economics, and for the 15 months through the end of last year, I was working as the Director for International Healthcare Economics at the Health Innovation Hub of the German Federal Ministry of Health. So I think really embracing what I think is a very important international and in particular transatlantic opportunity to collaborate on digital health topics, which I look forward to chatting with everyone about.
Fantastic. Ariel, I want to recognize your leadership in sort of bringing this group together. It has been a tremendously valuable partnership. I think it really has advanced science and harmonization of the use of real world data and evidence as we really think about a strong evidence base for sort of digital products. And I want to recognize sort of your vision for this and bringing us all together.
Thank you, Jen. Let me just say that DIME couldn't have been a better partner for all of this. And so it's just been such a pleasure to get this group together and to get the band back together today.
Fantastic. Yulia, do you want to go ahead and go next? We want to hear a little bit about your background and your expertise, but also tell us a little bit more about HIH for folks on the line who may not be familiar.
Yes, with pleasure, Jen. Thank you. Thank you for having me. So the Health Innovation Hub was, I have to say, a temporary task force working with the German Federal Ministry of Health in order to advance digital health actually in Germany. And one of the main projects was the establishment of a reimbursement framework for digital therapeutics, the so-called DiGA, and a couple of other topics we worked on. Myself, I have a background in public policy and economics, and I was working mostly on these regulatory questions together with my colleagues at the Health Innovation Hub. Looking forward to the discussion.
Fantastic, Yulia. Delighted to welcome you today. And as Ariel said, it's wonderful to get everyone back together. Nirosha, one of the best things about this collaboration was bringing together sort of industry and policymakers really thinking about what does good science look like across regulatory regions? How do we think about harmonizing that? You've been such an important voice in advancing that throughout your career. And then of course, during this collaboration, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. First, Jen, thanks so much for the invitation and to DiGA. Really excited to have this discussion today. I'm Nirosha Mahendraratnam Letterer. I'm Senior Director of Real World Evidence Strategy at Aetion and Head of U.S. Federal Partnerships. Aetion is a healthcare technology company, and our principal product is used to translate real world data into transparent, relevant, and reliable real world evidence. So I think about real world data and real world evidence all the time, and it truly requires the ecosystem to come together, and digital tools are the next frontier. So being part of this initiative was really a treat, and I look forward to the next steps.
Fantastic. Thanks for being here today. Thanks for all the work that you do, and I look forward to a great conversation. Last but not least, my colleague here at DiGA and my partner in all of this work with our HIH colleagues, Smit, go ahead and introduce yourself to folks who haven't met you before.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jen. And so nice to meet you again, getting the gang together of the HIH DiGA and everyone. Smit Patel, pharmacist by background. I am the new clinical innovation lead here at DiGA, looking more into healthcare delivery in terms of all these tools that are being developing. How are we going to adopt and implement and deploy it out to people who need us? You know, research is great and we need it. The longer stretch and the last mile is around implementation. And as Nirosha had highlighted, real world evidence is so critical when we bring these tools and applications from the research side to a more real world setting side. And I think that excites me every single day, and very excited to dive into the conversations today.
Fantastic. Thanks, Smit. Thanks, everyone. And colleagues on the line, we are not going to do a death by PowerPoint, although we obviously have a couple of images that we're going to share. The arc of the conversation, I'll give some sort of remarks from my side around, you know, really underscoring why not just the caliber, but the timing of this partnership was so important. Then I'll call on my colleagues to offer some sort of reflections from their perspective, both on the manuscript, the partnership, and the state of the field. And then we'll throw it open to conversation. So keep those questions coming in the chat, in the Q&A, and we'll make sure we allow plenty of time for that. So, you know, before we dive in, I was thinking actually this morning and reflecting on why I have so much sort of pride in this body of work. And to me, it's all about what good digital medicine actually is. And to me, it's not just about products or point solutions. To me, the digital era of healthcare is defined by access to data in ways we haven't been able to do so before. We've moved beyond a period in time where data lives in manila folders, locked in file cabinets in a locked room in your doctor's office or in the research setting. We have these opportunities for data to flow and for us to be able to answer questions about medical products, about standard of care in ways we haven't been able to before. And this initiative that brings together, I think, two pieces, which is the use of real world data and evidence, these flows of data, access to data in ways we haven't been able to before, our ability to apply new methods and computing power to really understand deeply what these data look like, what's not only efficacy of new medical products, but effectiveness. And the fact that the legislation that Yulia will tell us more about allows us to do that with new digital products, as well as, you know, existing medical practice and products, I think is very, very exciting. When we reflect on two of the greatest, I think, challenges impeding progress with sort of digital therapeutics and digital health apps more broadly, there's two pieces. There's questions around the evidentiary basis for some of these things, and it does vary across different products. The second one is challenges around market access, right? These are new sorts of products. How do you get reimbursed for them? How do you dispense them? So on and so forth. And what's extraordinary about the DiGA legislation and what we were able to do here was seize the opportunity that exists in Germany and increasingly in France and other areas of Europe, which is very exciting, where we can overcome two of those barriers, where we can think about what does good evidence look like, and how can we think about that in a setting where we aren't inhibited by bringing these products to market. And that was really the impetus for the DiGA-HIH partnership, which was to say, we have this opportunity, and Ariel, it's your language, but I love it. There's this very precocious policy that exists in Germany. How can we take advantage of that? How can we bring the global scientific and regulatory community together to say, what does good look like at scale? What's working really well in Germany? How can we watch and learn and embrace this? How can we bring the best methodologies to bear in this environment where it's set up to deliver on that promise? And then how can we back translate it into other regions of the world? So through a series of roundtables, these were the discussions we were having. We had 2 roundtables as part of these series that really focused on bringing the scientists and the product folks together. Then once we'd had some really robust discussion about good scientific practice when we're evaluating novel digital products, and when we're doing so with new methodologies and with real world data and evidence, what does good look like? Then we welcomed, and we were proud to do so, regulatory colleagues from North America, from Europe, and from Asia to the table to dig into how do we actually codify and harmonize this around the world. And we're not overstating the caliber of experts who joined us as part of the DiGA-HIH partnership. We can see here that we really did have leading academics, regulators, policymakers, sort of app developers, and scientists come to the table. And I think that this is a really important moment in the field for us to think about the appetite of not only the scientists, but also our regulatory colleagues to be part of this conversation and establish together what good looks like. And I think of the example, and I'm so embarrassed and I can't believe I'm doing this, I forget his new title, but I think about Bakul Patel's new role at FDA, and he's moved into this role where his primary goal is harmonizing evidence around digital innovation. I think these are things that are a bellwether for where the field is. And I think it's really incredibly exciting indeed. So in addition to those sort of regulatory roundtables, the other piece I wanted to pause and celebrate before we dive in with some of the meat of our discussion today were some of the other elements that we were able to celebrate as part of the DiGA-HIH partnership. And I think HIH has been absolutely fantastic at recognizing the opportunity that the DiGA policy afforded us and creating opportunities to engage scientists and policymakers and product developers in conversation, to do education, to do cross-pollination of learning. So we were delighted to contribute to 2 digital medicine weeks, bringing sort of the DIME community to bolster those fantastic efforts already underway by HIH. So at a mile a minute, hopefully I've given some good backstory to sort of what we were trying to achieve with this partnership. I'm going to stop sharing for a second because I'd love to come to you, Yulia. And before we went live, we were actually talking about even new numbers that are underscoring the success of the DiGA legislation. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit in summary. What was the intent behind that sort of legislation, and how is it playing out now it's been up and running for a couple of years? What does good look like over in Germany right now?
Of course, with pleasure. So Germany, of course, is not known for being a champion in digital health or digital technologies in general. I guess that's something we are pretty aware of. But the past government actually wanted to move ahead in some sections of digital health delivery and wanted to make sure that digital health can be experienced by patients, by physicians, or by healthcare professionals in general. And that's why this section of digital therapeutics, the DiGA, was identified as an interesting element that could provide digital health to patients and cut the discussion about infrastructure and cloud technology, etc. short. All those things that are not really interesting to patients or healthcare professionals, at least as long as they are not genuinely interested in digital technology. the act was passed at the end of 2019. So in 2020, in the fall 2020, we started seeing the first prescribable digital health applications. So they had passed a procedure at the FDA equivalent in Germany, where they have to show that they comply with sort of a set of general requirements: data privacy, data security, quality, criteria, and they have to show that they either have the evidence to show positive care effects, so effects on either the medical benefit they can provide, or patient relevant improvements in structures and procedures, which what sounds really bureaucratic, but in the end it's what we talk about when we talk about real world evidence as well. We look at how a DiGA can contribute to the reduction of the burden of illness, increase health literacy, etc. So the system has been up and running for a bit over a year now. We have 30 DiGAs that are reimbursed right now by the statutory health insurance in Germany. So this means they are able to roughly 90% of the population. And we of course know that this is just the beginning. Prescription numbers represent, of course, a fraction of what we see if we compare to drugs or other therapies. So it is only the beginning. There's no reason to be overly enthusiastic, but at least it's a first step where digital health has its own path to access reimbursement, and reimbursement is critical if it is supposed to be provided to German patients, at least. So we're very excited, and it will be very interesting to see how it continues. We've seen the first negotiated prices now after a couple of months, which of course is interesting, and it will be interesting to see how it evolves and how the current health minister, once he is not only thinking about the pandemic anymore, will maybe change, make some modifications to improve further how the system is running.
That's fantastic. And Yulia, it's a nice reminder that all of this happened, all of this progress was made against the backdrop of the pandemic, which I think makes it even more impressive to be at a point where not only are there 30 products in the chute with DiGA, but actually those price negotiations are happening. As we said, certainly in the US, if we look at some of the limiting factors, questions around evidence and then questions around market access, you've ameliorated those substantially in Germany. We'll talk a little bit later around how we're seeing some of this diffuse into other areas of Europe. But, you know, congratulations. I think what you achieved with the HIH task force is extraordinary. And I also think it's a testament to what thoughtful policy making can do when it's coupled with the scientific community in order to drive these things forward. So congratulations. Ariel, I'm going to come to you next, and I'm going to throw something up on the screen here for a second. The caliber of the conversations during the roundtable series was extraordinary, and we recently published this article in Lancet Digital Health Together, and the main findings were around, you know, what are some of the ongoing areas of focus as we think about advancing methodological best practice vis-a-vis digital products, but also as it concerns real world data and evidence. So I wonder if you want to sort of dive in a little bit on some of these findings and brief everyone on the line.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I won't do is read off of the slide to you. What I think it's worth just touching on all the headings here, though. I think these are you know, this is by no means an exhaustive list, but I think we really touched on what are the big things that the research community thinks about when we think about the key challenges and also the key opportunities for using real world evidence in the context of digital products. These are, you know, missing data, study endpoints, you know, how do we select and define those? And of course, DiME has wonderful work on this, thinking about what is an appropriate comparator group and in which context is that true? Multimodal interventions, digital interventions are often more complex, and taking that into account in our research design is of course important. We can't ignore that. We should embrace that and be thoughtful about it. what are the study questions we're trying to answer, and might those differ from the types of questions that we would be trying to answer in doing research about a traditional therapeutic? Health equity is not just a buzzword. This is actually really the promise of digital tools, is that they could start to get us there, that they could get traction in ways that the healthcare delivery system has not made enough progress in recent years. But yet we have to actually find ways to evaluate if we're achieving our goals or any goals with respect to health equity. I'm thinking about the generalizability of studies. How do studies in one context apply to others? All of the myriad confounders that may come up in the context of digital interventions. And then of course we want our studies and approaches to be fit for purpose. There's no reason to believe that the same real world evidence strategy for a mental health app is going to be appropriate for an app that's helping breast cancer patients recover from major reconstructive surgery. There may be commonalities, but we have to just be thoughtful about what are we doing here, and what are we measuring, and how can we generate the most compelling data in that context. I think taking a step back, I think what all of these challenges have in common is simply that they are they're new areas that research has, and frankly the folks doing our clinical research have been able to not dedicate much brain space to for many years. I think historically, when we think about the individuals who are used to conducting, traditional randomized controlled trials, we have all these best practices. They're sitting around, they're taught in everyone's master's level biostatistics course and clinical trial operations courses. And so these are topics that, the first thing we do is we say, oh, wow, this is a big problem. This is a new issue for us. But these are also just places where the research community hasn't had to do much work in recent decades. And so I think a lot of what we're doing these days is really just catching up on the fact that there hasn't been much innovation on the evidence side, on the statistics side in many years. And I want to give credit where credit's due. There are a number of organizations, a number of academics, but also organizations, which, Nirosha will tell us much more about this, that are being very innovative. But I think what I worry about a lot broadly is that we're not catching up fast enough. And I would even argue that the pace of innovation we're seeing today, coupled with this rapidly transforming technological set of technological capabilities that we have, is actually increasingly mismatched to the set of institutions we have for doing things like regulatory approval and reimbursement approval. RCTs and the traditional way of doing clinical research made a ton of sense for really static products. We develop, a new pharmaceutical product, a new molecule. We do our dose finding exercises. We try it out in patients. We make sure that it's, safe and effective in clinical trials. But that molecule actually isn't going to change over time. That is meaningfully different than how we think about digital tools, about how we think about digital therapeutics and apps. And by the way, the promise of apps, part of the opportunity of these digital tools, is that we can improve them over time. They can get better as we learn more, as the evidence accumulates as to what works, that we can improve these tools, but we have to just rethink all of our frameworks. And so, in short, I think thinking about these new challenges is really the task at hand for the international research community, and we need to collaborate, because how crazy would it be if evidence generated in one context were completely unacceptable in another context? Surely there will be components of, I was talking to somebody recently about what's happening in Sweden with their app policy. There are things that are specific to Sweden and tailored to the Swedish healthcare delivery system. And it would be malpractice for us not to take those into account when we think about how to launch apps in Sweden, of course. But that's not to say that when we launch apps in Sweden, we can or should, or it would even be remotely desirable to ignore all of the evidence that we're accumulating in other contexts. And so thinking about how to develop a common language and a common set of standards and best practices is, I would argue, the priority for really spurring innovation in this area. So that was my sort of impassioned plea for, I think, the themes of this manuscript. And it was such a joy to be able to collaborate and really put this all on paper. So thank you, Jen.
Gosh, of course. And, you know, Ariel, I think you hit the nail on the head there, right? Which is this is where we need to be sort of focusing our attention. We need to be establishing global best practice. And the gift with digital, although, you know, the challenge is things are moving quickly. And as you said, you know, we need to keep up with rigor, but is, to put a negative spin on it, but in jest, is we haven't got it wrong yet. We do have a blank slate opportunity where, you know, the field is very nascent. It may be moving quickly, but it is still young. We know what good science looks like. We don't have to throw everything we know out of the window, but we do need to be fit for purpose for these new sorts of products. So sort of as I think about the power of collaboration like we had here, we've demonstrated the power that that can have in terms of establishing some of these best practices. I also think that we can't overlook the individual roles and the sort of the different levers that our academic colleagues can pull, our policymaking colleagues, our regulatory colleagues, but also industry. So Naresha, tell us a little bit about what you're working on at Aetion. I think of bridging that gap between sort of where we've allowed perhaps the science to linger for a bit and catching up to the tip of the spear as we watch digital innovation really blossom.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jen. I'm going to start my remarks on something that you said earlier and building on some of Yulia's comments. The ability for us to use real world data and real world evidence in this context is largely due to the policy circumstances facilitated by this program, right? And so often we hear about the need for more value in our healthcare system and more equity in our healthcare system. And this policy enables both for two reasons, right? So if we're thinking about this from an equity standpoint, the fact that the meaningful benefit isn't just clinical outcomes, but also like focused on structure and process is huge, right? So it's not just, am I having a reduction in mortality, but am I able to access my healthcare provider, right? These are really meaningful steps and tools that can actually help transform the healthcare system, which I think regardless of what country you're in, we're always looking to improve patient care. From an evidence generation and a value standpoint, right? Everyone wants more value, they want more value, but there's two ways that this policy enables value, right? So one, if you're a provisional product, right, on the formulary, I think that's not the right word, but hopefully you know what I'm talking about. You have, you know, it's not just like, oh, I promise I'll do it, right? You have to come in with like a really good evidence generation plan, right? There are checks and balances in the program and you have to do it within a year or you get off. And then if you are fully provisioned, you have the opportunity to use real world data and real world evidence to support your value proposition and change your pricing over time if you're in fact seeing better benefit, or if the benefit is different, right, you maybe need to taper down, which is what the government is looking for. And so I just think it's worth taking a moment to step back and applaud those circumstances that this policy enabled, because it is so unique. So Jen, I think coming back to your actually intended question, you know, I've been working in the real world data space for a long time. And, you know, one thing that I take as like less daunting of a task is that the issues that we are now facing with either tools that are collecting data, or excuse me, digital tools that are collecting data, or digital interventions that are generating data, those problems are not unique to just digital tools, right? So missingness, confounding, that's a problem with any type of real world data you use. The difference is that what's causing the missingness and what kind of missingness and how you address it may be a little different, right? If you are in a clinical trial and you're supposed to see your patient every 3 weeks and they miss that appointment and you don't collect that data, that one missing data point is really big, right? But if you're inputting something into an app every day and you miss one, what does that mean, right? And those are questions we have to figure out, because maybe you missed it because you were really sick, rights, but the why may be different, but its impact is something that needs to be figured out regardless of the scenario. And so I think when it comes to like real world data and real world evidence, there are multiple disciplines that have to come together, right? Ariel, you touched on like biostatistics, right? We also need data scientists. We need epidemiologists. And I think a lot of folks in the payer space would say like, what is real world data? That's just the data that we use like day in and day out with decision making, right? So I think you need some economists and outcomes researchers, but it's bringing together these different disciplines as well as the different stakeholders to fully understand and realize the potential of these data. But I think there are lots of frameworks that we can use and build on. I don't think we need to start completely from scratch. But you're absolutely right, Ariel. We need to find a way to harmonize globally. And this isn't just within the digital space. This is a problem with traditional devices and medical products more broadly. But I think with this impetus, right, the small silver lining with COVID is that we had to become more comfortable with these traditional tools. And I'm hoping that that momentum isn't lost.
Narosha, I think you've hit so many high points during the course of your remarks. One of the things we ask at DiGA all the time is what's the same and what's different when it comes to digital, and when it comes to scientific best practice. There are many more things that are the same than are different. And what we often think about celebrating is how questions about digital and things like evidence and all the way through to equity are forcing questions that we ought to have been asking with this level of sort of intensity and all along. And so, we see it as sort of being a catalyst to really doing, answering those methodological questions, thinking about harmonization. There is an opportunity, almost a forcing function on that. It's also terrific to hear you talk about and really underscore the tremendous pieces of DiGA which get to not only evidence of sort of efficacy, but value more broadly. We think about sort of the expansion of that in Europe. Smith, it makes me think of all the work that we're doing with our colleagues at VA as well, right? There are more thoughtful questions being asked as the health systems are under increasing pressure in the COVID and hopefully post-COVID era. How do we think about these questions in a more sort of holistic way? So we're seeing this plan out here. Again, digital sort of the forcing function. Smith, you've sort of had a particular interest in how these best practices are diffusing across Europe, but also how can we shape our DiGA portfolio to keep sort of supporting and advancing these initiatives. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Can you tell us a little bit about the success we've seen across Europe and also how we're thinking about sort of fostering this ongoing evidentiary sort of harmonization here at DiGA? And let me throw that up for you.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing that, Jen. And I think one of the arc of the conversation that we are having today is around everyone agrees on one point is we need to harmonize globally. And just to give you a snippet on what's happening across the Europe and the Asia Pacific, we see a lag a little bit in the US regulatory space, but with the lead of Germany, which has, with the DVG Act, taken over and shown the world that, rigorous evaluations and reimbursement and fast evidence pathways can move. And as of last week, we have 30, and I apologize for not changing on the screen. It's 30 reimbursable medical apps that has been there. This is not just Germany. Other countries and other policymakers and regulators from across the Europe are looking at it and implementing it. Last year in October, France president, 31 as of today, as shared by Emmanuel. So it is growing and it's great. And we have seen more countries replicating that. And as last year in October, France president Emmanuel had shared that they will replicate the DiGA reimbursement for approvals, testing, piloting, and evaluation of these digital tools. And it's not just in France. We also saw a moment a month later from European Council where they had given a green light to this new harmonized regulations for the health technology assessment across the EU members, which essentially improves the access to not just the traditional medications, but also medical devices and new upcoming digital health applications. the stretch across has gone through towards the Europe, where ORCA, which had partnered with the Integrated Care System, the ICS, that provides over 5 million people with access to digital health libraries, where a lot of these informations, a lot of medical lifestyle issue solutions focused on mental health are being supported. And this is not it. More countries from Belgium, Denmark, Scotland, and our colleagues, Ariel and Julia, will have great insights on that, that they're not just looking at it, they're having active conversations in terms of how they improve market access and have reimbursement structures. And it's not just Europe. And Jen, if you can move to next slide, please. Asia Pacific has seen the similar wave that Germany has created across the world. Is the Australian TGA, which is the Therapeutic Good Administration, released a comprehensive overview on software classification of the products and what are needed in those classifications. We saw with Japan, where the MHLA, which is the Ministry of Health and Labor Welfare, and PMDA, which is the Japan's pharmaceutical device agencies, they collaborated, came together, and came up with SAGITI, and I may be mispronouncing, and I apologize. SAGITI is an accelerated pathway which provides breakthrough designations for much needed medical benefit digital applications. It shortens the timeline. It provides review submissions in English, apart from being in Japan language. Those are the steps that we are seeing in Asia. And last but not least, Singapore has started also looking into classification of software as a medical device. What does it all mean? If you go to next slide, please, Jen. We see that there is emerging trust in these digital technologies. However, there is another fear that is building in the innovators community, in the product developers community, in terms of they thinking around, if they have to get regulated, how long does it take? The investment capital they have to think about. They have to think about, like, what are the right pathways for them to get the optimized regulations that will inform more reimbursement and also adoption in the real world setting. And that's why regulatory processes are not limiting for these. Rather, it's the right regulatory strategy. And at DiGA, we always think about what we think. Let's test it out with the community. So next slide, please, Jen. So what we did is we did a small survey with our community, and what we found out is that 25% of the product developers actually didn't know if the product that they're building should be regulated or not. And out of those, 75% who knew that their product was regulated had blurry lines between, should I go with 510K if it's US, if it's de novo, it's breakthrough classification. What pathways? That tells us there are challenges in terms of those regulatory pathways and understanding that we can do better. And then last is, if there was a tool that someone can bring out, people would use those tools, and it showed in our survey. So we are excited, and Jen can voice over. In next quarter, we are releasing a new Tour of Dime duty, an initiative in a multi-stakeholder initiative around how can we make these decision mapping tools for pathways to bring clarity and support innovators to not just go through the pathway, but about thinking about long-term reimbursement, thinking about real-world outcomes, thinking about how they can deploy it out in the real world.
Fantastic. Colleagues, this has been a tremendous conversation. I hope what we've done for our folks on the line is sort of say, what got us excited about this? What was the impetus for all of this work? What's the success been? And specifically, as we think about not only the scientific best practice, but also things like regulatory and policy strategy, as well as, evidence sort of collection and generation strategies. What do we need to do? And then looking ahead, how can we continue to support the field? So we covered a lot of ground. We've got some great questions coming in. I want to make sure we have an opportunity to chat with our colleagues on the line. Leonardo, you've been very patient. I've just unmuted you. If you'd like to ask your question live, you should be able to unmute yourself at your end and then go ahead and pose your question live. And I'm in charge of tech, so that may be the limiting factor here. So Leonardo, if you want to either type your comment in the chat or let us know if you're able to pose it live, then we'll be happy to call on you. There was also a really good question for you, Ariel, from Yanni in the chat. He's dialed in from Switzerland today, and he was asking if you could sort of dive into a bit more detail on what the main causes are that could explain the sort of science not quite keeping pace with the leading edge of innovation there. What are the main reasons for it not going fast enough? And his questions were, is it sort of administration or is it other reasons?
Oof, I mean, this is, truly like probably $1 billion question, I think, in sort of digital health or healthcare innovation more broadly. Yeah, I think this goes back to actually a longer sort of piece of writing I'm doing. I think there are administrative problems, but I don't think there's any finger pointing we should be doing at any particular institutions. In fact, I think a lot of our institutions are being extraordinarily innovative. I'm writing a book proposal, and what I'm writing about in the book is that the technologies in general, and I very much put digital health tools of all kinds into this bucket, that have the potential to be the most transformative for healthcare today would be completely unrecognizable to the architects of our healthcare regulatory and delivery institutions. Things like digital therapeutics, things, software-driven medical devices. In the United States, I'll just use this example. As many of you know, anything that qualifies as a medical device is regulated by a 1976 Act of Congress. And in 1976, when the medical device amendments to the federal food and drug, the federal, federal, what is it? The medical device amendments, the Federal Food and Drug Act, created these pathways through which we bring new medical devices to market. And everyone was doing their best at the time to think about how do we do this in an evidence-based and a risk sort of based way. But nobody in 1976 had taken a step back to think about how do we do push updates to the software in embedded pacemakers. And this is sort of the type of thing I mean. And of course, in 1976, nobody was thinking about what types of clinical evidence are we going to need to show for a machine learning algorithm that's embedded in an app that patients are only using on their smartphones. I mean, that would be a ridiculous thing. And I really do believe that regulators did their best at the time to be thoughtful, but we're now in a world where we're stuck with these regulatory institutions that are a bit of a mismatch. And so I think the FDA has been extraordinarily innovative about creating new centers and creating new pathways and putting out guidance on things like real world data, real world evidence, and how do we actually work this in. But in many respects, we're trying to fit a square peg in a round hole in terms of our institutions. This is also true on the payer side. So how do we reimburse for things? Especially, I would say, in Europe, the way that we do health technology assessments, the way that we think about reimbursing for products is really predicated on this assumption of a static product. You have a drug, you have your RCT, you know the efficacy from your approval trials, and then you make a reimbursement decision based on that. But that's just completely misaligned with how we think about digital products. So, there's a long way of saying I think that there are administrative problems, but they're much more they're much deeper than just somebody needs to get their paperwork together. I think that said, I think that the fact that our institutions have shown so much willingness to get creative and get thoughtful and do what I call public policy innovation is very encouraging. And I think that that's a big piece of the puzzle. And I think that's actually a piece of the puzzle that's falling into place. And so now the onus is actually on the rest of the community to take seriously these guidance documents that tell us how to do good work with real world data and actually operationalize that. But it's a wonderful question.
Ariel, terrific answer. And you've seeded a couple of threads I want to pull on. Yulia, I wonder if we can start with you. Tell us what went into contemplating all of these updates that we have to think about as we write new policy on evaluating medical products in the digital era. The landscape that you were working on at HIH did indeed look vastly different to the original FDA sort of legislation from 1976. How did you tackle that as a team? How were you looking to the academic space? How did you dive into some of the really lovely provisions that exist today in DiGA?
Well, I think the framework tries to take into account that products change quickly, and so we wanted to implement possibilities to include these changes once they have probably also led to a change with regard to the CE mark. So there's this level before we even talk about the reimbursement, and I think that's a different discussion that we could have as well, how FDA and European institutions could align even better on these questions. But if we think about the reimbursement questions, it is difficult because it's something that is very new to our system. Because what we have done is we have accepted a new drug, a new molecule. For a new drug, we have had a process that has been in place for roughly 30 years now. So in comparison to the Federal Drug Act, rather recent, but still from a period where we would not see software change or systems auto improve over a period of time. And I think the framework tries to take into account some of these challenges by allowing businesses to do modifications to their product. But the question is in the end, how much of modification is possible without actually having to submit a new application, and that is still complicated because it will be something that also the regulator, so the agency in charge, will have to, on some cases, probably decide on a case-by-case basis for now. And then the question is, because in Germany we separate the approval for reimbursement and the actual price negotiation, what is the modification to a software product or software or digital therapeutics, and the price or the effect or the outcome it has. So I'm curious to see how, once the payers sort of change their minds a little bit, see the chances and see the opportunities that come with digital products and more transparency they can have, and also show some willingness to actually renegotiate prices in both directions and not only one, because we have seen only the downward negotiations right now. And the question is if this can be a sufficient incentive for companies to say, well, okay, we're going to improve the product and have an even better outcome. But since we know that price negotiations won't be successful anyways, then we probably won't come to the results we would like to see as society, but maybe not as payer organization. So that's not very easy. And I guess that's something that also depends on the healthcare system and sort of the mechanisms that are underlying.
Absolutely. And I like, Julia, how you sort of described how we see sort of examples in both sort of positive and negative directions, particularly around sort of price points and reimbursement, that will help serve as a bellwether for the field, right, around what good looks like, and provide those incentives to make sure that we seize the opportunity with digital innovation to deliver the greatest amount of value to the patients that our industry is ultimately sort of here to serve. I want to get to the questions in the chat, but Naresh, I have to come to you next just to ask, how do you think about this? Sort of through your career in academia and now in industry, you've always been focused on, you know, how can we use the best sort of methodologies possible to answer these questions as we see an evolution in what sort of fit for purpose evidence looks like. And, you know, we're thinking about value in different ways. You know, what have you been driving to really try and do everything possible to keep, you know, science in step with all of these advancements in policy and our collective understanding of what good looks like?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jen. So I think just like a principal tenet that I always go back to is you need to have like a really well-defined research question, right? So you need, like, when we talk about whether it's what is the clinical benefit here or what's the value, how do we measure that, right? And then I think the the second tenet that I always go back to is, do we have the right data? Is it fit for purpose for answering that question, right? And so I think the most common mismatch that I see, like why regulators or decision makers don't accept a piece of evidence, right? It's not even like bad science was conducted. It's actually earlier than that. It was, they didn't ask the right question, or they tried to jam a question that was inappropriate into a certain data sets, right? And so really following like the true scientific process, define a good research question, find a fit for purpose data set, pre-specify those analytical methods that you're going to use, right? Those 3 steps go a long way. But I understand, right? You're in the thick of it. You're trying to commercialize these products, and sometimes things get lost in the way, but there's a reason why those are kind of the 3 tenets to good research.
I love this. And I think that underscores some of the core principles we've been thinking about, right? Which is everything we know about good research and good science and good evidence doesn't go out the window because the landscape today does indeed look a little bit different to 1976, right? There's a real opportunity here to actually sort of push ourselves to be better while holding fast to those approaches that have been very good to us along the way. Let's see, I want to get to Kaylee Ann's question, but Arisha, it looks like I can ask you to unmute here and you can pose your question live.
Sure. Oops, can you see me?
We've
Hello.
got you.
Hi, everybody. Really, really interesting question. As somebody who is actually in the field and an entrepreneur developing digital health technologies, I think what we keep getting flummoxed with is how large does the evidence set have to be? Because this is a digital technology. It takes millions of data points to be able to train an algorithm. It isn't good enough to just have a cohort of 200 patients and do a little trial on them. So I don't think, I mean, there's a lot of ambiguity around that. And then comes the question of comparator devices, because lots of times there aren't any, there's no predicate device. So what do we do and how do we progress? I mean, we're hitting a wall constantly with this question. So I just would love to understand if there is any thought that's going into being able to address these issues. And it's across the board, not just the US, but also here in Europe where I'm from. Thank you.
Arisha, I'll share some thoughts on this, and hopefully my colleagues can follow behind me. I think I go back to a term that I use all the time that I stole from Amy Abernethy, who former FDA, now over at Verily, and she talks about this idea of the need for all of us in the community to support the growth of what she describes as regulatory muscle, right? This idea that our regulatory colleagues are going to have a better handle by some stroke of genius or magic to address and answer these questions than any of the rest of us out in the scientific community or industry or wherever we are. I think that's both unreasonable and not a pathway to success. So I think the fact that you're here, the fact that you're flagging these issues, the fact that you're saying, community, can we rally around and do this better? We need to keep doing exactly, I think, what we did as part of this partnership, right? Bring experts together, clear call to action around where we need to focus those tenets. And I was almost going to say, I'm thrilled to hear that your challenges map to those. I regret that you have challenges. I think that that's not sort of unique to you or your work, but I think we need to really engage with our regulatory colleagues, with our policymaking colleagues, and bring them on part of this journey. We can't either do the work in a silo from them out in industry and academia and then expect them to write policy and regulations without really understanding what it is we've been working on. We can't also sit back and wait for them to sort of draft the perfect regulations sort of in a vacuum from the brilliant work that's going on out in the field. I also think that in addition to it being collaborative, we all have our own responsibilities here. We certainly try and sort of broker those collaborations at DiGA. Others on the line, sort of what do you see as particular roles and responsibilities that different stakeholders have right now to address some of the challenges that Arisha shared with us?
I can just jump in with a few thoughts, which is, I think that there are a few places where interdisciplinary collaboration are more important right now. We all need to be talking to each other. I think that, let's go back to my example about biostatisticians. The biostatistics community needs to think about how do we update our own sort of how we teach students and how we teach doctoral students about what it is that they need to be doing in light of the priorities and the types of products that are coming to market today. But that will work best when that's a conversation in concert with actual innovator companies, with regulators, because, and this has happened before. It's not that biostatistics has always been ignorant to what healthcare regulators are looking for, indeed quite the opposite. So this is possible. It's just that, FDA and the European Medicines Agency and various other bodies have said, we're looking for slightly different things when we're using real world evidence. And so we need to just keep that conversation going. That's why we're all here today.
Fantastic. And I want to make sure we have time for one last question. Kayleigh-Ann, you put a great question in the chat. I'm glad you can give voice to it live. Please go ahead.
All right, thank you so much, and really appreciate the discussion. I know there's been evidence established of technology introduced to improve patient care in more of like medical technology, medical imaging, I know in altered reality and decision support in the hospital setting. But when it comes to digital health, I may be ignorant in assuming that the same technology or algorithms used for that are also being utilized and leveraged in digital health. So is there a line that falls between these current advances, and how can it help eliminate and argue the case for digital health to get these approvals through? So I guess my question was, what is a simple way to figure out like what's that missing gap?
I'll just say something quickly, which is I think that actually part of the bridge, and indeed one of our keynote speakers from one of these events we had was Dr. Ralph Brindis, who is at UCSF and has been one of the architects of how we learn from real world data in the medical device regulatory context, in particular with implantable cardiovascular devices, which is of course a pretty high risk setting. And I think that that's part of the bridge between what we think of as traditional therapeutics and sort of digital tools is I think the medical device context is the setting we've seen to date where there's been the most use of real world data and real world evidence by regulators. And I think that let's not pretend that doesn't exist. Let's do the exact opposite. Let's look at what we can learn from that context. Let's invite the experts who've been setting up registries, who've been working with real world data in the medical device context to talk to all of our digital health experts and see what actually translates, because boy, is it a heck of a lot easier to work with regulators and payers when there is a precedent for something than when there isn't. So I think we need to do all of the looking to that community that we can. That's my personal opinion.
A tremendous answer. I'm delighted you teased out the keynote that Dr. Brindis was able to give during one of our sessions. And Smit, I think this also underscores the wonderful vision that you described for the work you're leading sort of here at DiGA to keep sort of ensuring that our community is supporting this. So Kayleigh-Ann, terrific question. Really appreciate you posing it live. Colleagues, we're at the top of the hour. Everyone is back to back these days. So let's go ahead and wrap up. The first thing I need to do is thank my colleagues and co-authors, Ariel, Yulia, Narosha, Smit. It was a pleasure sort of being on this journey with you over the last sort of year or so. Incredibly proud of the publication we put out. I hope that it is sort of as valuable to the field as we certainly intended it to be. And here's to lots of ongoing work together in the collaborative space. Julia, especially, congratulations on the success of DiGA. And it's absolutely wonderful to see the precedent that you set in Germany being adopted more broadly globally. It is a testament to what good looks like, I think, and you've certainly set the standard there. Thank you everyone for being on the line today. We had terrific conversations, great questions. It was a pleasure being here with you all. And just a heads up, our next event here at DIME is later this month, and we're actually going to be welcoming Tom Millar from CISA, the Federal Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, as we think about the environment we sadly find ourselves in when we know that sort of biosecurity risks are probably at an all-time high. CISA has resources ready to go for the field, for the community, so definitely tune in for a briefing from Tom on current risks and resources available to you to be addressing those challenges today. So with that, Narosha, Yulia, Ariel, Smith, thank you again. Yulia, congratulations again. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.